Hello, everybody. So you're filing in, welcome. Give you a moment to connect. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 631st New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Alexander Dumbadze, Sydney Stutterheim, and Yayoi Shionoiri. We are thrilled to welcome poet Vlad Nahitchevansky here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host. Alexander Dumbadze is the author of Bas Jan Ader, Death is Everywhere from University of Chicago Press, as well as co-editor and co-author of Contemporary Art, 1989 to the present. He is currently writing Jack Goldstein, All Day Night Sky. His essays and criticism have been published in a variety of national and international publications. A recipient of a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, he is also a co-founder and former president of the Society of Contemporary Art Historians. Art historian, curator, and writer Sydney Stutterheim joined Gagosian in 2018. Her scholarly research focuses on post-war and contemporary art with a focus on performance practices of the 1970s and 80s. She is the co-editor of Poetic Practical, the Unrealized Work of Chris Burden, from Gagosian Press, 2022, and is completing a book titled Accomplices, developed from her doctoral dissertation about a networked authorship in the 1970s and 80s, which features Chris Burden as one of 4 main case studies. And our host today is Yayoi Shionoiri. As executive director to the estate of Chris Burden and the studio of Nancy Rubens, Yayoi Shionoiri is responsible for stewarding Burden's art historical legacy and promoting Rubens' artistic practice. She contributed to Poetic Practical, the first examination of Chris Burden's unrealized work, featuring 67 projects of varying scope and ambition that the artist was unable to complete during his lifetime, published by Gagosian. Thank you all again so much for joining and for being here today. I'm going to turn it over to you, Yayoi.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, for the lovely intro, and welcome everybody to today's iteration of the new social environment. I'm so delighted to be in conversation today with Professor Alexander Dumbadze, or Zan, and Dr. Sydney Stutterheim, and perhaps also some other special guests too later on, about Chris Burden and the idea of California art. A couple of thank yous before we start. Fong, Chloe, Carolyn, Cal, and the rest of the mighty team at Brooklyn Rail. The new social environment, I think, is in some ways a long durational performance unto itself, given that you all program this day in and day out every weekday. Knowing how hard it is to program even a seemingly simple 1-hour conversation, I know it takes so much forethought and organization to do this. So thank you. We are so beyond honored to be in community and in solidarity with you all. So when Zan and I were chatting during one of our earlier planning meetings about this conversation, he said something to the effect of, if Fong tells me to do something, I do it. And I very much share that sentiment, as well as an awe for and respect of all that Brooklyn Rail does for our interdisciplinary communities. Thank you also to Gagosian's team, especially Andy Trainer, who has been an instrumental team member to Sydney and myself for our publication Poetic Practical, which we will get to discuss later on, and who continues to support us in these conversations. You're in the Zoom with us in spirit today, as well as Alex and Kelly and others for the comms and social media love and support. I also see some Gagosian family members in the room today, including Sarah Watson, Camilla Johnston, and Jerson Hondel. So thank you so much to you all as well. And then finally, thank you to all of you for spending your cherished time with us. So today, what are we going to cover? We're going to scratch the surface on Chris Burden's early performance works. Some of Burden's works are very well known, right? Both in art historical context as well as in the general public's eye. Those pieces include things like Urban Light, which is the site-specific installation at LACMA, as well as the performance piece Shoot. But there are so many more works that Burden put out into the world throughout his career, and there were many works that Burden conceptualized, but could not actualize. So together with Zan and Sydney, we hope to spotlight some of CB's, Chris Burden's, earlier performance works from the 1970s, and also introduce you to some of Burden's unrealized works that may have some connections to these realized works. The unrealized projects that we're going to be discussing are featured, as mentioned, in our recent publication published by Gagosian, Poetic Practical, which includes, as mentioned before, 67 of Burden's unrealized projects. The book is a labor of love, mainly the labor of Sydney and Andy, where we took a deep dive into Burden's paper and object archives and spent over 5 years researching the book. In our time today at the New Social Environment, we also hope to touch a bit on the idea of California art, very much in scare quotes, and to see how Burden does or does not fit into this framework. So let's dive right in. Carolyn, next slide, please. One of my personally favorite Burden performance works is Disappearing. It's a performance that Burden undertook between December 22nd to 24, 1971, where he disappeared for 3 days. It's seemingly incredibly simple in its execution, but it also reminds us of how Burden himself conceptualized of his performances and his oeuvre. In terms of his performances, as a reminder, there are 3 components. One is the performance itself, which, depending upon the performance, sometimes had a large audience and sometimes not. Second, Burden almost always had a text description of his work. And these text descriptions are almost ekphrastic or meta, but it really guides the viewer in terms of what Burden himself would like for us to see. And then finally, number 3, there is what is referred to as the relic. It's usually a physical object that was used in the performance, which is then given this sanctity of realness. This idea of a physical object connected to a non-tangible thing seems to have in some ways a bit of resonance to how maybe some new NFT artists mint their NFT, which is digital, but also makes available a physical twin, sort of the idea of the phygital that perhaps Burden was doing way back when. Next slide, please. So here you see the relic to Disappearing, which is this sort of absence of materiality, and the text description, which is there as well, which I'll take the liberty of reading. It says, I disappeared for 3 days without prior notice to anyone. On these 3 days, my whereabouts were unknown. So taking a step back, and Zan, I'd like to now spotlight you. While I know this could be a whole semester of lectures, high level, Zan, when Burden was undertaking these performances in the 1970s, could you share with us a little bit about some of the things that are happening in the contemporary art scene at that time, particularly in California?
Yeah, thank you very much, Yayoi, and thank you for everyone for being here. And it's a real pleasure and honor to think about this and to talk about Chris Burden's work. You know, well, I have for about the past 15 years been working in some way or another on at least 2 artists who were active in the early 70s in the Los Angeles scene and who intersected somewhat peripherally with Chris Burden, that's Bas Jan Ader and Jack Goldstein. And I think what's really interesting to think about is in that context where Burden was coming up was one, the particularity of place of Los Angeles, how big it was, how relatively hermetic everyone's experiences were, and the degrees of isolation a lot of artists faced. I mean, both willfully, somewhat practically, and the ways in which I think this also engendered a type of creative practice that was not really possible in other places in the United States. And the other thing I would just sort of link in to go in is the ways in which LA, which was often pitted in opposition to New York, and especially, say, conceptual art practices there. One of the things I think what became interesting is for many of the artists working there, New York became irrelevant. And LA was actually plugged in to other locales, whether like Bremerhaven, Amsterdam, London, elsewhere, even practices, say, in Japan. These type of things, I think, make the type of scene where Burden's working, it actually made a lot of these new projects and performances possible.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. This idea of LA, right? And also this idea of LA as being pitted to New York, ironically, I think still kind of exists in the art world as we stand now. In comparison, perhaps then a follow-up question to you, Zan, in comparison to the work of the two artists that you mentioned, Bas Jan Ader and Jack Goldstein, what do you think is Chris Burden's positioning in this idea of LA, and why?
I mean, part of it, I think, where some of the differences lie, although he shares, I think Goldstein shares with Burden this, is that both of them began out of sculptural work. And I think the relationship of sculptural practices, the physicality, for Goldstein, the notion that sculpture sort of created this idea of space and distancing that continued into other practices. And Ader is a little bit different in relationship because of the filmic nature and their arrangement. I think if there are, when thinking about the three artists, or at least there, is that I feel that issues of representation are at the core, that while there's objects or performances or things, the medium is maybe a little bit less important and more of an inquiry about what is a representation, how does it work, how can you communicate things. And the sort of idea of performance is almost peripheral. It's one of many things.
Thanks so much for that. Perhaps I want to move on and show some other Burden's performances during this time, as well as some unrealized projects, and bring in Sydney's voice as well. Thanks, Chloe and Carolyn. Next performance we wanted to discuss is 747, a performance that Burden undertook on January 5, 1973. His text description reads as follows. At about 8 a.m. on a beach near the Los Angeles International Airport, I fired several shots with a pistol at a Boeing 747. What you're seeing on your left is some photo documentation of the performance, as well as the relic on your right. Thanks so much for your patience, Sydney. Now to you, what is your take or read on 747?
Thanks, Yayoi, and thanks to everyone being here for organizing. Well, this is an incredibly important work. For me, this work pivots on the notion of responsibility. Here, Burden is using or staging violence to bring about questions of accountability. So it's not about the spectacularizing violence, as his work has often been misread as these early performances, but in fact, yeah, he's thinking about responsibility. And so this is a work in which documentation is critical. This image on the left was photographed by Terry McDonald, this one-time event that occurred. He was there to record it, and this is evidence of that. But also, McDonald served as the only witness to this event. And, you know, the resulting photo, it shows Burden's actions, that he shot actual bullets at a commercial American Airlines aircraft that took off at nearby LAX airport. But also, if you look at this image, there's no incriminating evidence, right? We just see someone aiming a gun at an aircraft. And so this ambiguity to me is critical to this work. Yeah, he used real bullets, but he was in fact too far from the plane to ever actually hit it. So it was sort of this, it was a gesture rather than obviously an intentional, an intention to shoot the plane. But the fact that he did shoot at a commercial aircraft that took off nearby, put his photographer into a very interesting position, right? Especially if, or most importantly, if legal action was pursued. And this is an area that's sort of interests me, but, you know, he actually brought, if you think about the work's construction a little bit more broadly, so ostensibly the work's just about him shooting at the airplane, but he actually brought a set of blank bullets to the site of this performance and shot them off in advance of actually, you know, creating his performance work as seen documented here. So he had a contingency plan. And this was that if there were to be police intervention, if someone called the cops on them, he and his photographer, he could say, oh no, there's like a bunch of bullets on the blanks on the ground. No, we're just doing something. And it's very, you know, innocuous, when in fact he did shoot actual bullets at the plane. And although there was no police intervention on that day, sort of a funny story. A few years later, this image on the left was published in We magazine, which was like a men's magazine, kind of like a Playboy type thing. There was an article on Chris's work in 1975, I believe, and they included a lot of photographs of his early performances, such as this one. And actually, an executive at We magazine saw it and was like, how can this guy be shooting at an airplane and not get in trouble? And contacted the FBI. And so the FBI subsequently showed up at Burden's studio looking for him and to talk to him about this. But it's kind of interesting. So, I mean, for me, the work might appear to be kind of tightly focused on this one event, but I read it, and my interest is in how he implicates other individuals as well, especially his photographer in this instance.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sydney. And sort of to riff on what you said, it is true that I think Burden is often characterized as somebody who spectacularized violence. This idea of somebody who was like an evil Knievel, or somebody who was sort of a bad boy. I guess, you know, it's okay to be gendered about this, that he was kind of a bad boy. But in connecting that with what Zan was saying, I mean, I always think about the representational aspect of his work, that in some ways these relics, and also even the photo documentation, even though there is a penumbra of the photographer potentially being implicated in evidencing a potential crime, even then, these are very ascetic things. They look sort of almost kind of simplified and kind of like devoid almost of emotion. And I think that is the part of Burden's practice that I think is not often discussed, especially when people go in thinking that Burden was somebody who really used his works to shock. Let's move on to the next slide, please, because we wanted to talk about an unrealized project that may have some connections to 747. So what you're seeing is a spread from the Poetic Practical book about an unrealized project, The Hand of God. So Sydney, back to you. Please tell us about this unrealized project and what are some of the connections you see between The Hand of God and 747?
Sure. So this is a site-specific, this was to be, so this is an unrealized project, a site-specific, large format, outdoor kinetic sculpture that was going to simulate a giant hand. And you see on the image on the right, in this box, this was the only material we found on site at Burden Studio for this work, archival sort of materials. And here you see a sort of articulated, jointed, like modeling hand, which we assume is sort of how he was conceiving of the sculpture to look. And the jointed element is critical in this sense. So he imagined creating a 50-foot high version of something like this, but of a hand that would be installed near the Geisel Library near UC San Diego, at UC San Diego, excuse me. And so it'd be outside and the hand would kind of be inert. And then so UC San Diego is near a bunch of military bases. And so when fighter jets would be taking off, Burden imagined that the hand would activate in some way and then attempt to go up and start grabbing or simulating grabbing at the fighter jets flying overhead nearby. And so, you know, I guess both work. So we actually included 747, as you can see here. Part of our research and in the Unrealized project book is that we have this little tab for each entry that connects to related realized and unrealized projects. And so we included 747 because there are so many interesting similarities. This Unrealized project was thought about much later. Of course, this is taking sort of a concept that was explored in performance and then articulating it in a more sculptural fashion. But here it's both about simulating the disruption of airspace, whether through a gun or a giant mechanical hand, I guess. But yeah, this is a great instance of how there's working on the Unrealized project really illuminated a lot about the realized project. It deepens our understanding, let's say. Something like this allows us to think through maybe more about the construction of something like 747, thinking about them in relation, right? Like what's the crux of the actions that Burden was undertaking, so.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sydney. And it's true, over the course of this 5+ years of doing this research, what was very interesting for me is to see these like schemes of like thinking or themes or like questions that Burden continually throughout his career continued to come back to, whether that is sort of attempting to intervene in the sky, or whether to put up some sort of mechanical intervention that was triggered by something else in the natural phenomena. So I think those kind of connectivities that we were able to identify were quite interesting, especially when it comes to thinking about what is the role of unrealized projects as it affects an artist's overall oeuvre. So let's move on to the next slide. Another realized performance that we wanted to discuss is Solaris from October 23, 1980, where visitors were requested to come out to the Santa Monica Bluffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Burden, equipped with a walkie-talkie, floated out in a small canvas kayak out in the ocean, so far away that he could only be seen through a telescope. Onshore was set up a small transmission station of sorts with a walkie-talkie where visitors could transmit with Burden. In his text description, in part, Burden notes that a typical transmission would consist of something like the following. I quote, C.B. to Mission Control Houston, I am out here, I'm on the edge, I'm an astronaut, rotation 12/30, 39/52, 14/23, vector.027, hull temperature 273, out, over and out. And so what you're seeing on the left is photo documentation, on the right, the relic setup. And so this performance to me seems to resonate with ideas about sea travel, large scale travel, the artist's presence felt, even if they are not physically there. Let's bring Zan back up. Zan, are there other types of performances by other California artists working at that time that reflect an exploration of similar themes?
I mean, yeah. You know, I think in the case of this, I mean, the work of Bas Jan Ader becomes really big here because maybe many of you all know, and if you don't, it turned out to be, although it wasn't planned to be, the last artwork that Ader made was a transatlantic sail from Chatham, Massachusetts, and it was to go to Falmouth, England, in a 12.5-foot sailboat, which is a work of art that has grown and gained in mythic proportions, often around issues similar to the ways in which Burden's work sometimes is framed, especially in terms of free will, in ways in which, say, you know, an individual versus nature, and sort of giving up a sense of agency to broader forces that are beyond them. What I think is somewhat interesting relationship to all of this is that, I mean, compared to, I mean, with Burden and Ader, in Ader's case, he was actually a remarkably experienced sailor. The way he immigrated to the United States was at the age of 19. He crewed with one other person and sailed from Casablanca, Morocco to Los Angeles, or actually to San Diego. They were, so they spent 10 months at sail. During the, when Ader was teaching at UC Irvine in the early 70s, not long after Burden had finished, he would borrow Tony DeLapse, who was a faculty member there and a kind of a great painter and illusionist sculptor, would borrow his small sailboat, 12-foot, like I think like a sunfish, and would sail back and forth to Catalina Island from Marina del Rey, and that's about 20 mile or so. So there's a different sort of perspective in relationship to these things. What I think is really interesting when considering this, to go back to the point of representation, in the case of Ader, the goal of the sail, I think, was in many ways to make he was after trying to make a work of art that could exist without a context and that could exist without any type of communication or mediation, something pure. Trying to see, is it possible to distill an artwork to its essence? And a definition like that is tricky because it goes against how we tend to sort of understand art, because it's contextually, certain actions are contextually determined, and it tends to have to communicate through some representational system. And with Ader, there was no documentation of the sail, there was no planning for that. And this is where I think becomes interesting with Burden and with Solaris, or the other pieces where there are these various stages. There's himself as a type of performance, there's the element of documentation, and then there's the relic. And so there's sort of three levels that are going on here. And in many ways, the relic is most interesting because the ways in which that sort of charged object takes on metonymical association, but also has a type of embodiment to it, because in that relic, there's this image or presence of activities that once were there. And there's always something sort of looming there of Burden, or the idea of Burden, or the people there, or this whole sort of memories, which I think make it weirdly animate. And it has a type of way in which like a medieval relic would have, where it's at once something kind of divine and still just a thing.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that. Remind us again, when was Bas Jan Ader's piece? And I know it became his final piece, and we also
so he set sail July 9th, 1975. So it was going to be part of a 3-part exhibition. The first part happened at Claire Copley Gallery in April and May, and then there was going to be a third show at the Groninger Museum in Groningen, Holland, and that didn't happen. That was going to be in November of 75.
Mm-hmm. And I think thanks for that, Zan. And what I think is quite interesting to compare these two particular pieces is, as you said, Zan, Burden was so methodical about how he wanted his performances to be later represented by the sanctity of realness, these real tangible objects that the artist may have or may not have utilized or touched in the live performance aspect, but later on still serves as a reminder that in fact the artist was present, the artist actualized a work. Whereas I think with Bas Jan Ader's piece, as you said, it has taken on in some ways a mythic proportional level in terms of the work, partially because of what unfortunately happened to him. But in fact, it's that absence of presence that makes the work so mythic in some ways. Not to put you on the spot, but would love to hear your thoughts on how you felt, if at all, somebody like Bas Jan Ader or Jack Goldstein may or may not have been influenced by Chris Burden or vice versa.
I mean, that part's, I think, really interesting. I mean, at least from what I've heard, so Burden was more successful early on, and I think more things were happening and more media attention was coming. There was the Esquire magazine piece, I think, in '73 that brought much bigger public attention. Both Ader and Goldstein, who were rival, I mean, they were, I guess, frenemies. I mean, you can say at this time when they're hanging out, they were each, I think, really ambitious and really competitive, and probably also really insecure. Ader had said, in passing to people that he didn't think Burden's work was poetic enough. It was too physical. which is interesting to think about these distinctions, right? And I think it has less to, there are different sensibilities and different sorts of points of reference. With Goldstein, he's obviously, I think, understood and seen within this narrative of postmodernism and appropriation from the 1980s. What's strange about his practice is from the very beginning, from the first days of art school at Chenard, he was copying everyone's work in a certain way. And when 1 or 2 weeks after Burden did his Dead Man performance at Rika Mizuno's gallery, Goldstein restaged his burial thesis piece there too, where he actually had himself interred in a coffin inside the gallery instead of buried underneath. And even that burial piece was probably riffing off of work by another student at CalArts who had done something similar at the time. So there are funny ways in which I think there are awarenesses of Burden's presence and the physical intensity. I even say less shoot, but think pieces like Bed Piece or the ones that these sort of durational works, it sort of upped the expectations or possibilities for people.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And before we move on to the another unrealized project, Sydney, did you have any thoughts to respond to what Zan was just saying? Unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. The point that Zan made about giving up agency to bigger forces, I think that's incredibly interesting. And it actually does connect to the next piece that we're going to talk about. Actually, if we can move into the Unrealized project. Is it okay if I jump into this? Because I think there's an interesting connection here. So this is an Unrealized project by Burden called Moon Piece. And basically here, you could see in the bottom right, so he wanted to use NASA technology that was being kind of employed in the 1960s, which are these satelloons, they're called satellite balloons made out of reflective mylar. And Burden was hoping to create a very large format version of it. He wanted to create one about 1/5 of the size of the moon and launch it into space. And so it would be in orbit and be visible to the naked eye. And so, I think here that speaks to Zan's point about, these artists thinking about maybe like the world outside the self in some way, and those natural forces. And this was an incredibly important work. And I think, it's sort of, you could see the extent to which he wanted to stage it in various contexts, because he tried to have it executed through Documenta and then Creative Time and then through an Australian art collector. So the fact that he was sort of constantly pursuing different ways to create this work, again, connects to kind of what he was thinking about with regard to, this idea of giving up agency, I think is interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Sydney. And I keep coming back to this moon piece that Burden conceptualized of it in the 80s. And as you mentioned, Sydney, he kind of like came back to this idea. He had like multiple iterations of it, and he pitched it to multiple people in the 80s. And I keep thinking, it's in recent memory that we now have commercial space travel, that we have individuals who are relatively well off, of course, it's not for everybody. But in the past couple of years, we've had a fair number of people have the opportunity to go up into interstellar space or some part of space, and that it is now becoming perhaps a reality for people to take spaceships. And so just to think about the fact that Burden was many decades ahead of that. I also know that sometimes there are some commercial space travel spaceships that take artwork in to space also, that has been of, I think, recent memory also. And so to think that perhaps maybe if he had only come up with this piece in the 21st century, maybe there is a little bit of a possibility of it being realized. And perhaps what I'm doing right now is just putting it out into the real universe, that if anybody is interested in helping the Burden estate attempt to realize some of these pieces with the current technology that is available to us, where to find us. So next slide, please. Let's just look at one more performance from Burden, which is The Curse of Big Job, which is actually a 6-month-long ordeal from December 14, 1977 to June 22nd, 1978. Sydney has written an article about this as well. Burden got obsessed with and bought a 1952 Ford rig tractor trailer combo, and it had the words "big job" on the side. And Burden obsessed about finding economic utility for this truck after he bought it. He thought, ooh, like maybe I can take it around and use it to transport things and make money. He was quite interested in this idea of like not it being an art performance, but finding economic utility. But over the course of time, Burden himself, in the text description of the artwork as it becomes an artwork, he describes the truck turning, quote, into a giant liability rather than the fantastic asset I first envisioned, close quote. So logistical nightmares abound. The truck had mechanical issues. Further, Burden found out that he didn't even have the right permits to drive the truck. And then later on, authorities mistakenly came after him for an accident that involved the big job truck that had occurred even after he had already sold off the truck. So again, from his text description, Burden quotes, "I felt that I had become guilty by association and that big job possessed a curse, which I could not get rid of." So what you're seeing on the left is a photo of Burden in Big Job. And on the right is the relic, which is a 24-inch pipe wrench in order to take Big Job's gas cap off that Burden had to buy when Big Job ran out of gas. One of the categories of objects that Burden was interested in throughout his career is cars, perhaps stereotypically gendered, but there we are. So let's move back to Sydney. Next slide, please. What are your thoughts about Burden's use of cars as a material? And would you please take the next couple of minutes discussing with us some of his unrealized projects using cars?
Sure. Okay, well, cars are, as you mentioned, a recurring motif in Burden's work. They kind of appear in two different forms. You see him thinking about sort of urbanism, so he's thinking about cars more generally, but also then he's using them as actual objects, often in the, well, either full-scale versions, like in his sculptures, or, you know, let's say motor vehicles rather than cars, but something like the flying steamroller, or even toy cars. So like his little, and he built his own car, B car, but yeah, the little hot rod cars that are used in works like Metropolis. And so, you know, this motif of cars in its various forms, I mean, it certainly relates to his ongoing exploration of American masculinity, but also when we were thinking about the toys, I find it so interesting that his work, you know, is often pulling out the very adult themes or the latent violence that's found in children's toys or things that sort of seem otherwise innocuous. And so, okay, so what we're looking at here, all right, so this is a drawing that Chris made in 1999, How to Shrink LA. And so this work, I'm going to talk about the Expanding Contracting Cities, which is an unrealized project from 1995, but unfortunately there was no physical visual material that we could reproduce in the book. So we actually reproduced this image, which is a drawing of a similar concept to the Expanding Contracting Cities, which is an unrealized project that I'll explain in just a moment. But just to briefly sort of say what's going on here, this is a drawing for a proposal Burden had to develop the technology to create these multi-lane superhighways in which, and you can kind of see them, you know, drawn out here, and there would be digital slotting of vehicles. So depending on where you have to go in Los Angeles, you would get into a certain lane and it would allow you, so some of them are going 250 miles an hour. So basically shoot you along, excuse me, this track within your car while driving. So to prevent, like, if you don't have to get off on a exit coming up, you get shifted over to a further lane, you're going someplace further away. And so as you see on the top, it would sort of cut down the travel time, Woodland Hills to Pasadena, 15 minutes, or Santa Monica to downtown, 5 minutes. I mean, that would be impossible. But anyway, so he was thinking about modifying the urban environment in Los Angeles and thinking about, and going back to Zan's point, about Burden really thinking about the idea of place in Los Angeles and how that was so important. I mean, here's a great example of that. Expanding, contracting cities. So this was a work, he actually proposed it for his exhibition at the MOC in Vienna in 1996. It did not get realized. Thus, it's in the Unrealized projects. But basically what it is a project in which you want to visualize the urban environment, more how people experience it rather than how it's actually sort of topographically laid out. So by this, oh, sorry. Okay, I was hearing some noise. Basically, it consists of 2 video screens, one a map of Los Angeles and one a map of New York. And he wanted to put up, it would feed in, the computers would sort of feed in real-time information about traffic patterns. And so there'd be 2 coordinates selected in each city, and basically the map would change. It would expand during increased travel time, like during rush hour between 2 coordinates, and then sort of contract and come closer. So it's more about, changing to depict, real-time traffic patterns. And actually, Nancy Rubin said that this work was influential for Burden's metropolises, which are these sort of miniature cityscapes using toy cars. So, he was thinking on the macro scale and on the micro scale in terms of, in something like Metropolis. And then I think we have one other slide. If we could go to the next one regarding the other Unrealized project. Yeah. Okay, so this is the work Car Stories. And this is from 2005. So this is one of the spreads from the book. What we're looking at here are, this work probably relates more closely to Big Job. In that, so as I mentioned before, Burden used cars in a more kind of thinking more about urbanism and public space. So that would kind of be represented by expanding, contracting cities, or How to Shrink LA, let's say, or the metropolises. But also he thought about them in kind of this more biographical or psychological aspect, which is so funny. And I absolutely adore the Curse of Big Job. Is so fabulous because it's funny, and he gets, incredibly, it's like it ends on the sinister note. And anyway, and he's like, he has this antagonistic relationship with this truck, and it's this sort of nemesis that he also loves. All this to say that those ideas actually kind of play out in Car Stories, which is, I guess, to explain it kind of most generally, it would be like a sculptural self-portrait of Burden using all the vehicles he owned in his lifetime. So on the left, we have a list of, he was sort of compiling ideas for Car Stories. So what he wanted to do was create bronze small format replicas of all the vehicles he had acquired at various points in his life, often used in artwork. So you see on the left, you have Big Job, you have Steamroller. So on the right column on the paper on the left, Forklift. So Steamroller relates to the flying steamroller, Porsche 911, Porsche with Meteorite. Volkswagen, he included the light blue VW Volkswagen Bug used in Transfixed very famously. So he wanted to create all these replicas to kind of say something about himself, and these would be accompanied by a very short text explaining why they were significant to him. And so in that way, he was thinking sort of about, maybe in how cars or vehicles, for him, but certainly often in these tropes of like, American masculinity, how, one is tied to their identity might be tied in some ways in certain cultures in the US, like to, the cars they drive and what that says about oneself. So here he's sort of thinking through a self-portrait in this really funny and interesting way that's very characteristically his own style. I guess
Thanks so much for that, Sydney. And I think sort of one of the very interesting things that I just wanted to point out on the spread from the book is how rich Burden's paper archives and object archives are. And in some ways, you know, the idea or conceptualization of archives is highly subjective, of course. You know, like we never really know when we're looking at an archive why certain things are in an archive versus why certain things are not. And we don't know why, for example, there were multiple copies of the same thing, or like a clip out of an article or a magazine or what have you. Like it's sort of this weird subjective treasure hunt that the artist has left for us. But Burden, I think in some ways had a very highly organized mind, and he left us with these notes as well as kind of copious sort of thoughts as well as lists, which I think in some ways were just another way in which we can learn more about Burden's thought processes as he thought about conceptualizing and actualizing his works. So we're sort of like coming up to the kind of nearing the end of the hour. So I want to start wrapping up. Want to talk to both Zan and Sydney a little bit more, but kind of scale back out. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you both is why is Burden still relevant now, and what sorts of ways can we as art historians or lovers of art or art world connoisseurs or art professionals, how do we keep artists' legacies relevant, active, and alive? Maybe Zan first.
Yeah, I mean, like there are two things I was thinking in relationship to this when you're showing about the big job and some of these other notions. I mean, I think one, his notion of work or labor and the ways in which particularity in LA in the 70s, a number of artists kept on thinking about, well, maybe I should just get a real job. And the sense of it becoming an artist and getting a normal job and this sort of blur of labor, and especially how conceptual art pushed that, but also working in an art situation where there was no expectation to make money. But on the flip side, cost of living was still so cheap and everything was still affordable and doable that you didn't have to make that much money to do things. And those sorts of possibilities of thinking about work and honest day's work, and that sort of relationship. I mean, this, you know, for 9 months, Ader as a secret artwork was a commodities broker. He just got a job and made it as a work and started this, you know, trading. And he writes in notes like, you know, wear a tie and get a job. These type of things I think are still really interesting to deal with. I mean, the thing that I keep on coming back with the early performances, also with Burden, that I think still what he asks of viewers, I think, is really complicated, problematic, and really weird. I mean, the moral responsibilities that the performances put people on, whether it's shoot and essentially putting the 12 people in attendance as an accessory to a potentially attempted murder. There's assault, the ways in which people might have to intervene or watch, and this sort of boundary between an idea of art and the space of physical harm, and the ways that could also have been mediated through using monitors as a distancing effect or some aspects of stuff. But this constant pressure of someone, whether just being a passive viewer or having to step in and say, no, this is wrong, or no, this can't go on. And I think those type of questions are still really pertinent. And the ways in which, especially in a very mediated world that we live in, where do we sort of essentially go through the screen and start doing something and say no? These type of things I feel with their performances are really are still really relevant.
I'm going to jump in here. Yeah, I mean, going back to your question, why is Burden still relevant now? I mean, certainly his performances were groundbreaking, and the fact that performance is so, such a dominant medium today, I think that sort of speaks to, we have to look back, and his early work, the 70s, was so influential and really brought performance into a different place. But, also I think his work is relevant now because I think it was misread, as we were mentioning earlier, and he sort of disavowed that sort of, sensationalized version, reading interpretation of his work, and he cited it as a reason for giving up performance by the mid to late 70s, and he thought he was misunderstood. And so I think, there's it's sort of what my research focuses on, and sort of what Zen was pointing to. I'm interested in questions of responsibility, but thinking through maybe these more canonical works by Burden, but reframing it and thinking about who actually was involved. And quite often there was no audience, and yet these questions of responsibility come into play. And then how does that shift our understanding of what Burden was doing in the context of particular works? But then you think about his practice more generally. And I think the questions should be shifted, or at least maybe the answers, I hope, at least that's what I'm working on, or shift a bit from what is typically seen as his work and the parameters of his work.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And just to respond to you both, I mean, at least for me, from my perspective and the estate's perspective, I am very interested in the idea of California art and the idea of LA as an art city. And what does that mean? Like, what is that history, her story, their story of LA as a metropolis, as a place for creativity? And of course, the pull that the East Coast has on that relationship. And I think some of especially the way that the Los Angeles contemporary art world is doing right now in such an interesting, fertile kind of way, I am interested to see more and more how we can think about that idea of Los Angeles and the idea of how California features as a place within the practice of so many of these artists. And so, I look forward to sort of thinking more about that and sort of onwards as we continue our work in the estate. Zan and Sydney, any last thoughts before we open it up to the floor? Do you want to tell us about some of the projects that you're working on or otherwise? Maybe. Or Zan, either one.
Oh, sorry, the sound cut out for a second.
Sydney, go ahead.
Oh gosh, okay, well, as was mentioned before, I'm finishing, I'm just in the revisions of a book that was based on my doctoral research titled Accomplices, and it looks at these very issues. Burden is one of 4 case studies that I examine, and I'm thinking about different models of responsibility and agency and how that shifts forms of authorship in the 1970s and 80s. And the other case studies are, so it's Chris Burden, Hannah Wilke, Martin Kippenberger, and Lorraine O'Grady, and which seem like they wouldn't necessarily connect, but I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about how they use other individuals and how so-called accomplices come forth as a paradigm in the 70s and 80s to think through issues of accountability.
Thanks so much for that, Sydney, and best of luck as you continue your preparations there. Next slide, please, before we have Zan. Zan, go ahead.
So I think finally finishing this book on Jack Goldstein, which has been it got bigger and bigger and bigger this is I guess part 2 from what was an Ader book, and I think a planned trilogy, an LA trilogy that I'm working on right now that will maybe another 20 years or something. But the impetus of the project, like Ader and Goldstein, and was this notion of with both those artists, the idea of Ader, Goldstein, is in many ways more important than their works and the art that they make. And I've been really interested in that sort of problem and thinking about this sort of mythic aspect and how that comes through. which is also then gives me sort of methodologically ways of thinking about a kind of biographical work that's going on that treats a biography as another type of representation and another type of image that becomes bound up with the works of art themselves. And something for my own work methodologically, especially at spending time talking like medievalists or people working in areas where there's not much, I felt like so much of the material, who, what, where, why, how of all this work needs to be documented and put into a type of narrative and story. And so that's been a big part of my work, is I guess a sort of big archival and spending a lot of time interviewing and talking and trying to take these sorts of mythic things and bring them down to the very mundane, ordinary day-to-day life, and take that as part of a practice. So with Goldstein, this grew because Ader only had a 7-year career and only 33 works. It was a lot easier, and there was also one archive put together by someone very generously who gave it to me. This has been a little more complicated, but about 40 more pages to go, I think.
Very exciting. Thanks so much for that, Zan. It's exciting to know that your magnum opus will soon be available for public consumption. Which is
opus, yeah, that's very kind.
So thank you so much again to Brooklyn Rail for hosting us, and thanks to you, our wonderful audience, for listening in. For those of you who are interested in the book, Poetic Practical, I don't know if anyone can see it, probably not, is available for purchase at gagosianshop.com. Please don't be a stranger. On the previous final slide, you saw ways to find us on the interwebs. And I think from here, I'd like to open it up. I believe Robert Horowitz is in the audience. Bob is an artist and a writer and someone who's experienced Burden's performances in real life. Bob wrote an incredibly insightful article that I believe G.E. Schwartz was even quoting from in the chat about Burden's performance works in Art Forum in 1976. And I wanted to spotlight Bob for his thoughts. Maybe you want to share your lived experience of Burden's performances, or maybe your thoughts on the relationship that Zan, for example, discussed between the performance and the relic and what that means for their respective audiences. We will open the floor to you.
Thanks, Yayoi. Wow, this has been really something special, really much better conversation than I expected. I don't know that I have a lot to add, because many of the things that I wanted to address in the article about Chris in an art forum is exactly what Sydney and Xander are still talking about, what, 30, 40 years later. And I wrote that article because I didn't think people understood Chris's work right, basically. And I'm very happy to see that the things that drove me to write it really seemed to be the ideas that lasted as the defining or characteristic work that mattered in Chris. I was thinking before tonight, how did I meet him? And I really don't remember. I can trace it down. It must have been either through Ron Feldman, who was his dealer in New York at the time, because Ron and I were very close friends at that time, or through Willoughby Sharp, who was the publisher of Avalanche. And I was friendly with Willoughby as well. But I remember so vividly going to Ron's gallery once, and he showed me the catalog 71-73 that Chris had just published, documenting the early performance works. And I thought, and then he showed me the videotapes that he had done, Through the Night Softly and Poem for LA and things like that. And I thought that the people that had written about Chris really were missing the point. And I'm, as I said, I'm just happy that I got a chance to write about him. And because the editors from Art Forum were fired right after the article was published, so my door closed right after that. But anyway, thanks for having this conversation, and that's really all I can add. One thing I can add that's maybe a new observation. Several people have mentioned something that occurred to me at the time also. I used the word Chris's works were organized around a premise. an idea, you might say, but not just an idea, but a premise, that is a situation that could be realized. And Yayoi used the word scheme to mean the same thing. And Sydney used the word crux to describe the same thing. And I think we've all identified that that's sort of what held the pieces together and allowed you to make links from one piece to the other, because they all had that kind of structural similarity. They were all very strong gestalts, but they weren't closed usually. What made them gestalts was the premise, or the idea, or the crux, whatever you want to call it. But the fact that they weren't really enclosed for most of the time meant that their boundaries and who was responsible and what to judge when you were judging the work was often very unclear, and it included the spectator as an element in the work, usually. But the thing that really impressed me about Chris's work later, the way it unfolded, was that he wasn't just a one-trick pony where he had this idea of the premise or the crux or whatever. He found so many different applications of imagination to develop some of the same very simple ideas that he was dealing with, but just in really wild examples. Like Samson is probably my favorite piece. That is so brilliant. I keep coming back to that as my absolute favorite. And the floating steamroller also, I think, is utterly brilliant. And the one with the car and the asteroid going around, which is very similar. In other words, the way he was able to keep innovating and growing and exploring things outside the basic structure that he had mastered very early on. That's really what made him great. And that's all I'll say.
Thanks so much for that, Bob. It's sort of nice to know that, many, many years afterwards, we all continue to think about burden and continue to think about and analyze burdens, our historical legacy. And perhaps maybe one of the reasons why he allows, or his work allows, for us to do that is this idea that you mentioned of this openness. Of course, there is Gestalt. And as you said, right, there's this premise, or as Sydney said, crux, or this idea or kernel or what have you. But there is also this open-endedness that allows us to continue to think about his work and continue to think about how relevant the message that he may or may not have had continues to this day. So thanks so much, Bob, for that. And I think there are some other questions also. I think Charlotte had a question. Maybe there are some other ones. And also I want to mention G.E. Schwartz has been commenting very heavily in the chat in this kind of almost beautiful poetic response to some of what's been happening. So I would encourage you all to read those comments also.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yayoi. And Bob, for that. So yeah, Charlotte Kent, I'm going to mute you here. You should be able to ask your question. Let's see. Great.
Hi. Oh, thank you, everyone. So I was intrigued towards the very end. Yeah, you made this sort of passing comment about LA as an art city and its sort of geo and social locale and the influence that has on contemporary artists. And it's something that I'm particularly interested in. I feel like LA has a sort of set picture in people's minds because of an earlier period of work, but that it's continued to sort of evolve. And when you said that, I was just wondering if either you or any of the panelists could speak to what you see as being some of the attributes of the city or of the artists working in this sort of broader sort of geosocial area that are, particular to what is coming from this space. And just to tie it back to Chris, like in what way he maybe exemplifies that, or has really taken a sort of distinct position away from some of that. So it's a speculative question.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that speculative question, and thanks for joining. Zan or Sydney, do you want to take this first? I have my own thoughts, but I would love to hear from you too.
I mean, I suppose that, Burden continually mined the city. If you think even about his street lamp works, right? Those are from, those of you who don't know, his street lamp sculptures. Yayoi has behind her the one LACMA, but Urban Light. But those were taken. He sourced vintage street lamps, actual functional street lamps from the city of Los Angeles, and then would recombine them into different sculptural configurations. And he produced a whole body of these sculptures. I think LA, sort of just going back more generally, LA allows for perhaps, certainly, I think in the 70s, there was a sense of experimentation that was possible there, a little bit outside of some of the conversations that were happening, and maybe it allowed for a certain freedom that you see. I mean, Chris was up in Topanga Mountains. He was really sort of pulling himself out of even the Los Angeles. He was involved with the Los Angeles art scene, but he also kind of was doing his own thing. And of course, he did performances like Back to You in New York at 112 Green Street, and then he did other performances in Europe, like Napoleon D'Or. But I suppose, I mean, Burton kind of took himself out of the LA scene, but again, he staged many of his most famous performances. Now I'm thinking about it in Mizuno Gallery. It was Dead Man. He staged that out front. And so he was both involved with the LA art scene, but I think he's a particular instance perhaps, and maybe this is characteristic of California artists of the 70s more generally, that you have your own space. You're not in the city. LA is a different sort of, it's like a suburban urban environment where you can sort of pull yourself out of the fabric of the city, and in Chris's case, be in Los Angeles, but also live in the Topanga Mountains and sort of not see anyone. I think at the time he first purchased land there was incredibly undeveloped. And so, he was both in and part of the city, but also maybe that's what's unique, the possibility that you could kind of disappear into a city. And maybe that's something to mention.
Thanks. Zan, what about you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I feel like I could only speak of it from the 70s, and I can also speak of it as someone who's not from there, and as someone who lives in New York, and who views it in a somewhat different way. I think the 70s, what made it great was there was just enough institutional structure, but not too much, and there is just enough to give people support, but not enough for it to be overbearing. It was also super lucky in the timing institutionally to have like Helene Weiner at Pomona, to have Claire Copley open her gallery, Rika Mizuno. You had these people who, Helene was 23, I think, at the time when she started being the curator at Pomona. And the type of critical vision to start seeing, the first show she curated was a 2-person show of William Wegman and Jack Goldstein. That's pretty interesting in 71 to start with that and to think about these type of options. The disproportionate amount of good art schools, I think, was important at the time, and the way Chouinard was so central to all this. And then CalArts, and the way CalArts began as a sort of institutionally sanctioned anti-institutional institution. When they were at Villa Cabrini in Burbank, and the types of stories you hear from that first year, I think, are great. But what happens when they move, to the present location, I think is really important. Almost everyone I think associated as California artists are not native Californians. Maybe Matt Mulliken, but he's someone you don't often think about. That I think is really important. The one who I feel is of that generation is Alan Ruppersberg, and Mr. LA, whose work actually takes on a William Levitt, whose take on LA sometimes as a subject much more. For someone like Ader, it's peripheral, it's in the background, like in Search of the Miraculous, where like these images of the city, but it didn't have to necessarily be there. But, and I also think with Burton, even he is working, a lot of the key works initially are in Orange County. They're in Anaheim, and that's in 1971, 72. That's really out there, right? And going from Pomona was really far away. To go from Pomona to Anaheim, to Irvine was actually faster than to say go to downtown. To be in Venice, for Burton being in Venice, that was also weird because the Venice scene was all these light and space or sort of these other types of things. Wegman was there, he was in Long Beach. Nauman was in Pasadena. There's, David Hammond's, there's ASCO. This type of, the role of place, I think, is is the geography, but it has so much to do with just enough opportunities and just enough structure, but not being restrictive. And that's not really possible, I think, after 79 and 80 as the art market changes and the sort of, and more, unfortunately, the galleries, Copley closed, Mizuno keeps on going, Margot Levin comes, but that sort of structure changes. And that's, the Pasadena Art Museum, when they close us down, I mean, that could have been something really different if they, Helene moves to New York, these type of things, I think, transform the way things are working.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sydney and Zan, for that. And before I actually turn the exact same question back to Charlotte, I think my couple of 2 cents on this, sort of fast forward several decades, LA, I think, has definitely become an art city. What I see coming out of contemporary art in LA at the moment is very different from what I'm used to seeing in Brooklyn and in New York City. And perhaps some of that potentially could be related to the idea of economic utility and economic efficiency. At the end of the day, having a studio practice in New York City is incredibly hard because it's very difficult to find big spaces that are reasonable. That's not to say, of course, that LA is particularly a cheap city to live in, perhaps in relative terms. If somebody is a young sculptor coming out of art school, wanting to be in the East Coast, but just cannot have the opportunity to have the studio space in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, for example, or Greenpoint, or what have you, or Bushwick, then sort of the possibilities of looking elsewhere, I think, becomes this necessity almost. And when one moves out to LA, there's a possibility for a larger amount of space for a slightly more reasonable amount of money. And then also added to that, to sort of reflect on what Zan was kind of getting at, is that LA is such a dispersed metropolis, so that the idea of these artist communities are actually these like minor molecular niche communities. And I always feel this way, given somebody, I'm an East Coast person, I get to work for LA artists, so I get to go to LA, but when I experience LA, all the neighborhoods have very distinct feels in terms of the type of artists who we find there in the neighborhoods, even within LA. And so there might be more of an opportunity for people to find their niche community. It might actually be harder when you first get there, but I wonder if that also has something to do with it. And that seems to have been the case even from when the 70s and 80s, sort of that area of expertise that Zan was speaking to. Putting it back to Charlotte, because I know that she does a lot of research in LA and she travels quite frequently there from the East Coast. What are your thoughts about LA as an art city?
Well, that's unfair. The whole point of being an audience member is to ask questions that you don't then have to answer yourself. But I guess I would just say, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about it a little bit differently. I think there's some other attributes of LA that are really important in the contemporary scene. I think, that thing of being, between the water and the mountains, right? Of like these really different geographic locales, and the way in which I think about how geography influences the type of thinking that can take place. But in that same way, I feel like there's something really interesting happening with contemporary artists that are grappling with a really broad set of socio-political issues right now, because it's actually such an incredibly diverse space that is constantly having to confront those differences in a way that I think, in part, I mean, I don't know why we always have to compare LA to New York, but in fairness, I live here, so I will do it as well. In New York, we get used to compartmentalizing in the sense of like, if you don't compartmentalize on the subway, you are actually going to lose your mind, right? Whereas in LA, I think sometimes that space makes it feel like when you have to confront some of the social dynamics and the economic and political dynamics, there maybe isn't that same compartmentalization. And so you see artists that are dealing, producing work around environmental issues, around indigenous rights, around a lot of different sort of identity positions that I think have a type of subtlety in part, maybe I'm not quite sure what it is, but I see this kind of like really exciting conceptual work coming out of there. And it does feel like it's something that's about LA because of the way it's different from the way even similar topic type work appears when it's coming out of, say, New York or some other places. Anyway, I'm still grappling with it. So that was why I threw it out to all of you.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. And sorry for putting that question back onto you. I apologize, but it's great to hear your voice.
One thing I would just add real quick, just when we talk about this and this polarity between New York and LA, is not to forget that, like, in the 70s and 80s in New York, it was empty too. I mean, the population declined by 1 million people throughout the 1970s. Neighborhoods that, you know, if you live here now, it can't even imagine what, you know. So I think that part is also really important to consider. It's not just an LA thing, but it happened here. One thing that maybe geographically that LA has advantages of, just the physical space allows still a type of isolation that New York is compressed. But, you know, most good chunks of Manhattan in the 1970s were still relatively empty or isolated. Good parts, you know, were, and in Brooklyn. So I think that part is still, to have space to be alone and to be isolated is not a bad thing, and still be close enough to folks. And, you know, those things were possible for a lot of artists because everything was still cheap. And until you know, the cost of being an artist became so exorbitant, that's where I think a lot of things start transforming in that. Thanks so much, Sam. Carolyn, back to you.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Charlotte, for an amazing question. For our final question, I'm so happy to turn it over to our very own Fong, who will ask.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you. Thank you, Zan. Thank you, Yayoi. Sydney. Terrific talk. I'm sorry I had to go in and out, just constant meeting, but I remember having interviewed Connie Llewellyn, who did that show, State of Mind, New California Art Circle, 1970. We talk about a lot of artists for sure, but one thing that was quite apparent to me, there's a different temperament between Northern California and Southern California. And the fact that the initial recognition that they didn't have to be emulated in New York art scene, that's already, I think, occurred even as early as the, you know, late 50s, when people like Richard Ebencohen and others trying to come and show New York. So it was clear in that way. And as I mentioned to Connie, Maurice Lomaque, Matisse's sort of colleague in the fourth movement, say something very witty. He say, intelligence is international, stupidity is national, and art is local. And I think somehow in California, it's set up to be that way, where, as Zan just pointed out, you know, it's spread very incredibly horizontally large. And the only community that can bring people together is the art school. And that's where the exchange really happened with ideas. But, you know, I was talking to Alan McCollum years ago for the Rail, and we were talking how he learned a little bit more about the mysticism of Gurdjieff, which is so interesting. You don't think someone like Adler, obviously, the disappearance and named after the book, Zen, that you mentioned, The Search for the Miraculous. And that was a very important book in the time. I mean, maybe people downplay Gurdjieff and Opensky, but there was a very strong presence here in New York, also in the late 30s through John Graham, who have known him, very important artist for the New York School, de Kooning, Pollock, and others have great admiration for Graham. But going back a little bit there, because I have a pleasure in spending some time with Wilbur Sharp, who ended up being in my building as a neighbor before he passed away in 2008. So there's a presence of Willoughby through Avalanche, which is kind of intense. It's only existed, what, 6 years, 70 to 76? It had immense influence by way of many people who advocated for, of course, boys in California, in San Francisco, but we know that boys never made it to California. But Willoughby was a constant voice, and I know that talking to, Jack Reynolds, who was a student of Gordon Woods, who then was the dean of San Francisco Art Institute, were able to bring all kinds of people to California. Case have gone there many times. Certainly Robert Watts and Cunningham and other people, Capro certainly ended up being there teaching. So we all know that. So to reduce to a certain specificity is impossible task. But I just want to follow up a little bit what Bob was saying earlier about burden. I think because of that insistence on making things light, very light, there's a lightness and playfulness in most of the conceptual performing art scene, but burden seemed to imply a sense of implied violence, and the fluidity in his multitude of deploying performance, sculpture work, it was very, very intense, and it's like a fox-like temperament at its best. And I think that's why he so stand out from the rest of the performance artists and artists in a larger sense, And I feel like his presence is very strong, especially what we're going through now. I began to look at his work differently, certainly after September 11 also. So that's something I've been trying to contemplate, that incredible intensity of his, endless, vast thinking. And it cannot be really put in a certain category of medium or any other kind of category. So I just I'm grateful that you all came and talk about his work and unrealized work, which love to see more coming, maybe part 2, part 3, I don't know. So thank you for come on and do this together, you all. Thank you so much. Back to you, Carolyn.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Fang. And thank you all endlessly. Can't say thanks enough. We have a tradition of ending our community events here at the Rail with a poetry reading. And I'm really thrilled to welcome our poet today, Vlad Nahitchevansky, here today to the stage. So Vlad, I'll turn it over to you to close us out. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was a real pleasure getting to hear about Chris's work, and just thank you to everyone on the panel. I'm just going to start and just roll right through. It is a fact that work will be there, but an assumption that the money will also be good or as present as the work. The sun cools off a bit now, the talk, dirty and passively considered an affliction to be tied to these fraught small rooms of complaints. The agency, as I remember, reassures openly living in debt, not caring for conversational rosewater, then Miami, Massachusetts, Oklahoma, creatively exercising or considering the variable growing of a life. I washed my hair last night, vacuumed the apartment, tattooing thoughtlessly into the fullness of small tasks that inscribe each evening, that settle a malleable but stubborn ethics. When I write, I cross the street and buy the things I need for the week, and it seems to me the most appropriate way to spend this life. The boxing of peaches in the summer, the truck made of dust, driving and all the peaches tumbling out the back of the truck onto the road, the rarity of joy found in the counting of lost goods, and looking up from the counting of smashed peaches, the shaking of leaves. Last winter, I thought of all that was happening around me as a selfish extension of my living. The gulf that we were experiencing had lost its heart in the Turnbull. The occupation, not even a dumb cigarette could preoccupy, but the anxiety, just as real and lovingly felt. A web, credible as a diary, as credible as placid water and hubbub of small town gossip. I follow that train of thought as far as it will take me until it is Friday and we are eating hamburgers and helping ourselves to the light amply shining through the holes in our web. our web, a rather pretty web, opaque and built of rhetorical vernaculars, lovely web of soft things that pass through. They are kind, and maybe that's the only way to speak of it. The feeling of considering the different things that move us. Communicative sticks rubbed together make dawn light in this place and the ones we can now imagine. Seclusions. Here's a list of herbal agents: fresh thuja leaf, red root, mullein, and lobelia salve. New York, July 29th. Character of 20th century blue, don't tell. Outside, it's 100 degrees. Inside, it's even hotter. The adverse reaction of the places God touched you before you fell from heaven. A copy of Vogue rolled up, stuffed in a back pocket. Great Gulf of Mexico. Your red hat leads with its brim. Seen from aerials, two swooping birds, a group of women passing shawls, etc. Carthusian monks on the esplanade, trolling for a double spring but wronged, bored with the others where they have come. Seclusions. It being so it and no I, but you jumped up. Let's drive to Canada. Heads for Shenandoah, tails when a picture of you with dress around your Y flipped 180 said, I've been physical like silence, like snow, like crabs eating shit off the end of the pipe. Set change. For love, I would, candle from both ends. Everything washing with soap, not out of vulgarity, but because I'm misunderstanding things. I approve this message. How far am I from cancer? How far are you from sleep? I jerked him off when I was 12 years old is what I should have said, but there's no there or wish, no admission of guilt to free you of it, or place to slip to, but flee at the sign of danger, return at the moment of fatigue, and fix my face to your hand. Lord, if I knew what I wanted post the painting, then marking the center with black dots would be an act of untold aggression. Seclusions. By night he lights small fires and huddles against the wind. The Bahi grass shakes like a dockhound. The tattoo was done in Yakuza style and shifts like a ponderosa. Shots of Cointreau, blue tank strap, or new memoirs. Just as much as I can take in the summer. The Mobil station, the Stewart, the Texaco. Eucalyptus essential oils, blue dahlias that were tread on, the Met, and I likened everything to Hera, not industrious or lazy, but you said the ceiling a Grand Central curved like the bridge of my nose. Aquiline, Greco-Roman, maybe Eastern Orthodox, Armenian, Azeri, Georgian, where they play hopscotch, they play nurse. You head unencumbered, they pack onto the crowded dance floor and kiss each other's necks. And the next morning, into the mountains, watching the heat rise in parts of Jersey where the sun also sets. I would like to be with you this time, splitting strawberries in the kitchen, wherever you are. On Tuesday, but no matter where the lonesome day is any day, it's the person speaking that stands at the top of a building in his bumble convertible parked downstairs and sees people doing the wrong thing. Jack, I like the color secrets. Really? Have I once lied about it? Once told you what you can do? You know what you can do. Was it syphilis that killed the apes, trapped the great lions in stone, drew blood from scratching the itch? Then the talk petered out. On a slanted ridge somewhere in Waco, 2 ex-soldiers, 2 red suit soldiers in white gallon hats walk a valley blue. Jack, the truth is, the only reason for keeping an eye peeled is sleeping with one eye open. It's possible this could be the beginning of a novel or a drought. The New York Times estimates that 3% of unpublished poets kill themselves. That's rare. Crazy, those passages traveling through the night, fruit bats descending in the night, yucca stalks fruiting on the cusp of summer showers, now spume, strawberry colored in the cape, an accessible wane in the recital of ashes, laid for a few miles to rest in great solemnity. Forget when it's reasonable to remember, and remember always. The wind blows hard. The shark 20 yards offshore we could kill, invalidate our sudden fright. Die of cancer at the age of 83, and I believe it. I've kept secrets this long. In a way, it's no secret. Dim hour of purple light and hollow bone, into the Sunday morning cartoons, campfires, and sneaking alcohol out onto the lake. Breaks down in stars and red wool jackets, jackets of cumbersome wool. In the valley, warmth exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat slides off our shoulders, bluing slow in the dead, up in the dawn. In between, love has grown, but still my friends acting rank strangers, lost in their vast entangled webs. From dug firs I watch them, the ocean's piercing jewel puff smoke in yonder window. Algae bright in sequin shirts, I imagine their moves. Even now, we should medicate, said, over those hills are where I keep the orchids, is where I keep the dusk-charged air. Back to secrets. There was a boy I knew in grade school who asked me to touch his cock. He smiled when I did, and I almost smiled, but I didn't know what I was doing and laughed, and he punched me in the side of the head for laughing, and so I smiled the next time. It's always beautiful with Loretta when the rain falls, like a dying animal beneath your feet. Friends are lovers, and for them, I am repeat breakdown. So as nude ekes from the pond, and at its banks everything happens the same. Your elbow alone in the grass, under a Mardi Gras of opaque silver, an outcry riot calling along alphabets in the boiling square. What comes from rubbing finish in your hands as rumors crackle peace again? Elsewhere, they think counter to action, the anonymity of it, though I cannot help but watch friends make their thin escapes from society when at the bar discuss the punchline. Is public housing real or landscape? A small bridge or a shell? A pale machine moves up the street, a pencil of breakdown proportions. As hot as it is, there is only sunny weather, damp. There is always more to what we say, but it too has run away. Just the moment you hear, oh my gosh. Sorry. Just the moment you hear someone come in through the front door and you are still unsure which way your heart will leap. A pale machine is in the street, left intact, unwillingly relocated, and it has made home in our wages. Perhaps it too wants play. Around the pit, the breeze does not reach us. We do not need a breeze. We do not need the water. We do not need the mountains or the air. We do not need government or the money or friendship or forget about the stars. Just the pit, the dark machine, the street. Remember the morose. As in this poem, I am upset to dive through the concrete and come out in a place without cameras or sound or any of the world I admire. At 6:30 a.m., the shadows crackle peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vlad. And huge thanks again, Sydney, Alexander, Yayoi. We'd also like to thank Gagosian, of course, for helping to make today possible. We would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rails YouTube channel. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations in our monthly publication and in our public events, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our 100th Radical Poetry reading with Sahar Maradi, Zaina Hashembek, Hejung Cook, Jasmine, Eli Washington, and Mina Zohal. And thank you all endlessly so much again. You can turn your microphones on and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Yayoi, for all the organizing. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you,
Thank
Sydney.
you, Alexander.
Thank you, Vlad.
Thank you, Vlad. That was amazing.
Vlad.
Beautiful.
Thank you.